The Janitor's Silent Kindness. The palace of the alien heiress stood high above the shining city, its walls built of silver stone, its pillars carved with glowing runes that spoke of pride and power. Inside those halls walked nobles in long robes, speaking in proud voices, and servants rushed to obey their commands. Among them was one who did not belong, a human janitor, carrying a small bucket and a simple brush. He moved quietly, his steps slow, his head always lowered. Most did not see him at all, and those who did often looked with cold eyes. To them he was nothing, a shadow on the shining floor. But to one small soul he was different. In the far corner of the grand hall sat the heiress's daughter, a fragile child bound to her chair, her legs weak, her arms thin. Her eyes often stared at the ground, for she was ignored even by those of her own blood. The janitor noticed her day after day. He would see her sitting in silence while others walked past as if she was air. He felt a quiet pain in his chest, for he knew what it was to be unseen. Without a word, he began to clean near her chair. He moved slowly, carefully, so the sound of his brush on the floor would not disturb her. At first, she did not look up. She thought he was like all the others, a servant who cared only for duty. But one day, as he scrubbed the floor, he saw her blanket slipping from her knees. The air of the palace was cold, and he noticed her small hands shivering. Without thinking, he set down his brush. He lifted the blanket and placed it gently over her legs. His hands were rough from work, but his touch was soft. The child looked at him in surprise, her eyes wide. For the first time in a long time, someone had cared. He gave her a small smile. Not too bright, not too bold, just a simple human smile, and whispered softly, "You are safe, little one." His words were almost lost in the vast hall, but the child heard them. Her lips trembled, then curved into a weak but true smile. The janitor felt warmth in his chest, a warmth he had not felt in years. He picked up his brush again and returned to work as if nothing had happened. From that day, his routine changed. Whenever he saw her, he made small gestures. If her cup was too far, he moved it closer. If her toy had fallen, he picked it up. If she looked cold, he adjusted her blanket. Each act was simple, yet each act carried more care than the grand words of the nobles. The child began to wait for him. Her eyes would search the hall until they found the quiet human with the bucket. Her lips would twitch into small smiles, waiting for his kindness. What neither of them knew was that someone else had begun to watch. The alien heiress, the mother of the child, had passed through the hall one evening. She had stopped in her steps when she saw the human kneeling before her daughter, not as a servant bowing to power, but as a guardian giving comfort. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She did not speak. She did not step forward. She stayed in the shadows and watched. She saw how carefully he lifted her daughter's toy, how gently he wiped the spilled drink from her lap, and how quietly he whispered words that even she could not hear. A strange feeling stirred in her heart. For years, she had surrounded herself with power, wealth, and servants who obeyed without question. Yet not one of them had given her daughter such quiet kindness. Why would a lowly human, a janitor of all beings, show more heart than her own people? The heiress did not reveal herself. She turned away with her thoughts heavy. She told herself it was nothing, a trick. Perhaps the human had some hidden plan. Perhaps his kindness was a mask for ambition. Yet the image of her daughter's smile, rare and fragile, stayed in her mind like a thorn she could not remove. The next day, the janitor came again. He found the child staring at the floor, her small hands restless. He crouched down beside her chair, his eyes soft. He asked, "Would you like me to clean here today, near you?" She blinked, then gave a small nod. His heart lifted, and he began to sweep slowly, speaking simple words, telling her small stories of the city he once walked. She listened, her eyes brightening, and for the first time, laughter, light and quiet, escaped her lips. The sound reached the heiress, who was walking nearby. She froze, her chest tightening. She had not heard her daughter laugh in months. The sound struck her deeper than any blade. She stepped back, hidden once more. Her pride battled within her, anger at the human's boldness, confusion at his kindness, and a small, dangerous spark of gratitude she did not want to feel. The janitor never asked for thanks, never sought reward. He simply continued his quiet acts of care, and in the shadows of the palace halls, the alien heiress watched with a heart that slowly, against her will, began to change. Whispers in the palace. The palace was always alive with movement. Nobles moving gracefully across glittering halls, guards marching with polished armor that shone under the crystal lights, and servants rushing to obey every command. Yet beneath the grandeur there was always gossip, soft whispers that moved faster than footsteps. Whispers were the true veins of the palace, carrying secrets, rumors, and suspicions. It was through these whispers that the story of the human janitor and the heiress's disabled child began to spread. At first, it was only the servants who noticed. They saw how the human lingered near the child more than his duties required, how he paused to straighten her blanket, how he bent to whisper something gentle that made her eyes brighten for the first time in many seasons. Some servants frowned at his actions, their voices low with disapproval. "He is overstepping. He is forgetting his place," they said. Others shook their heads, their whispers carrying a tone of disbelief. "Why would a human care for a child of our blood? What does he hope to gain from this?" As the whispers traveled, they grew heavier. Some imagined dark motives, saying perhaps the human wanted favor from the heiress, that he acted out of cunning, not kindness. Others thought he was foolish, wasting time on a child whose own people barely spared her a glance. The palace was a place where every gesture was weighed with suspicion, where nothing was ever seen as pure, yet no one could deny the strange change in the young girl. For the first time, her laughter echoed softly in the halls, her hands no longer restless, her eyes no longer always cast downward. That was a change no one could ignore. The heiress herself began to hear the whispers. They reached her chamber doors carried by worried advisors. They spoke in half-muted voices, telling her that the human janitor was behaving in ways no servant should. Some warned her, "He could be dangerous, my lady. He could be planting trust to use it against you, against your daughter." Others whispered differently, "Perhaps it is harmless, but such a sight lowers the dignity of the household. A noble child cared for by a human janitor. It will stain the family's name." The heiress listened without revealing her thoughts, her face calm, her eyes sharp, yet inside her heart there was turmoil. For she had seen with her own eyes the tenderness that the whispers now carried. She had seen the way her daughter's lips curved into a fragile smile, how her eyes lit when the human drew near. She had even heard the soft sound of her laughter, a sound that pierced deeper than any counsel's warnings. And yet the whispers pressed on her like chains. The nobles would not forget such talk, and once whispers became fire, no power could put them out that night. As shadows stretched across the palace, the heiress made her choice. She could no longer be content to simply watch from the shadows. She would know the truth for herself. She summoned 2 of her most loyal guards and ordered them to follow the human after his duties. She wanted every detail, every word, every action. Nothing must escape her sight, for if he was a danger, she would know, and if he was not, she told herself she only wanted proof. The guards followed quietly. Their heavy steps softened as they moved like hunters in the night. The janitor, unaware of the eyes upon him, finished his duties as usual. He scrubbed the long stairs, polished the handles of the great doors, and carried his tools back to the storeroom. But instead of leaving for his small quarters, he lingered. His path turned not toward rest, but back toward the chamber of the young girl. The guards exchanged quick glances, suspicion flashing in their eyes. Through the slightly open doorway, they saw him crouched by the child's chair. He carried no bucket now, no brush. Instead, he held a broken toy, one of her small carved animals that had lost its legs. With hands worn from work, he began to repair it, pulling a small piece of wire from his pocket, bending it carefully, shaping it with patience. The child watched with wide eyes, silent but filled with wonder. When he was done, he placed the toy in her lap, and the little girl's laughter bubbled once again, louder than before. Her joy was so pure that even the guards felt their suspicion weaken. The heiress, when told of this scene, felt her chest tighten. She had ordered her guards expecting betrayal, expecting trickery, but instead she was given a truth she could not deny. This human, lowly as he was, had spent his own time, his own effort, to bring joy to her daughter, a joy that her wealth, her servants, and her noble blood had failed to give. She turned away from the report with a storm raging inside her. For the first time in her life, she began to doubt the weight of her own world. Still, the whispers did not end. They grew sharper, spreading among the nobles now. Some spoke with anger. This cannot continue. A human should not be allowed to act as family to the blood of our kind. Others spoke with mockery. Perhaps the heiress favors humans more than her own house. How far will her pride fall? These words reached every ear, poisoning the air of the palace, and though the heiress kept her face calm, though she spoke no word in public, inside she knew the fire was spreading, and she could not hold it back forever. The janitor, however, knew nothing of the whispers. He rose each day as he always had, carrying his bucket and brush, his steps slow, his head lowered. He cared only for small acts of kindness that no one else would give. He did not seek power, he did not dream of reward. He only wished to see the little girl smile once more. To him, that smile was worth more than the gold walls of the palace. And in the silent corners the heiress continued to watch, torn between her pride, her fear, and the growing truth she could no longer ignore, the janitor's secret. The palace was vast, its walls reaching into the sky like the bones of an ancient god, and within its shining halls every step of a servant, every whisper of a noble, and every sound of the guard's armor echoed like thunder. Yet, for all its grandeur, there were places where silence ruled, places where no noble cared to walk. In those quiet corners the human janitor moved each night after his duties, his shadow long against the lantern light, his bucket set aside, his brush cleaned and stored, and his tired feet carrying him not toward rest, but toward something hidden, something only the child in the silent walls had seen. It was in one of these hidden moments that the guards discovered him, for the heiress had ordered eyes to follow him until the truth of his intentions was revealed. They crept silently down the long marble corridors, their armor muffled, their steps cautious, expecting perhaps to catch him stealing from the storerooms or sneaking into forbidden chambers. Yet what they found was not greed or treachery, but a strange scene that made them pause in disbelief. The janitor sat upon the floor of the girl's chamber, a small lamp beside him, the fragile alien child leaning forward from her chair, watching him with rapt attention. In his calloused hands rested a toy carved from pale stone, its body chipped, one of its legs broken away, a thing long forgotten by the noble household where beauty mattered more than sentiment. But to the child, it was a treasure, and the janitor knew this. For weeks he had gathered scraps of metal, pieces of wire, and fragments of discarded tools left behind by careless workers, and now he used them with delicate care. His rough fingers, trained to scrub and sweep, worked with surprising gentleness as he bent the wire, shaped it into a frame, and fixed the toy's broken limb. The child's eyes followed every movement as though watching a miracle unfold. When at last he finished, he placed the toy gently in her lap. The child's thin fingers traced the repaired limb, her lips trembling before they spread into a rare smile. And then came laughter, soft and fragile at first, then growing, filling the chamber with a sound so pure it seemed to cleanse the air itself. The guards, hidden in the shadows, shifted uncomfortably. Their orders had been to report danger, to expose plots, but what danger was in this? What plot could be found in a man who gave his time and skill to mend a child's broken toy? They left that night confused, their report heavy with details the heiress would not easily ignore. When the heiress heard of the toy, of the laughter that had reached even the guard's ears, her heart tightened. For she had not heard that sound from her daughter in many seasons, and the truth cut deeper than she wished to admit. Her wealth, her power, her noble blood, all had failed to bring such joy. Yet a human janitor, nameless, lowly, had done it with wire and kindness. That night she walked alone in her private chamber, pacing before the high windows that looked upon the city. Her pride warred with something else, something more fragile and more dangerous. She told herself she could not allow this, for it lowered her name. It threatened the dignity of her house. But beneath that shield of pride she felt the quiet voice of her own guilt, whispering that perhaps she had been the one to fail, not the child. Meanwhile, the janitor's secret grew, for it was not only toys he repaired, but small things others would never notice. He had found that the wheels of the child's chair squeaked painfully, straining with every turn, and so he worked late into the night to smooth the joints, oil the hinges, and polish the wheels until they moved with ease. He had seen that her blanket was too thin for the cold nights of the palace, and so with clumsy stitches he patched together scraps of discarded fabric, shaping them into a cover far warmer than the silk one the nobles had given. Every act was quiet, every act unseen, yet each one carried a piece of his heart, and the child, though she did not speak much, began to glow with life again. The servants began to notice changes. They saw the girl smile more often, her eyes lifting when the human walked near. They saw her clutch the repaired toy in her lap, holding it close even when nobles passed her by, and the whispers grew louder. Some whispered of danger, that the human was bewitching her with tricks, that he sought to bind the heiress's heart to him for his own gain. Others whispered with a touch of wonder, that perhaps this human was different, that perhaps the stories of human cruelty and weakness were not the whole truth. But in the palace where pride ruled stronger than reason, suspicion weighed heavier than admiration. The heiress received every report, read every whisper, and still she did not act. She stood often in the shadows, unseen, watching the human bend low before her daughter with patience and care, and each time her heart battled within her chest, she wanted to call him out, to remind him of his place, to remind herself of her pride. Yet the sound of her daughter's laughter and the sight of her small hands reaching for the human's repaired toys chained her voice. She said nothing, she only watched. One night she asked herself aloud, "Why does a man with nothing give more than those with everything?" Her words hung heavy in the empty chamber, and though no one answered, her own heart whispered truths she was not ready to hear. For she knew that his kindness was not born of duty, nor of ambition, but of something far rarer, something she herself had long forgotten in her world of power, compassion without condition. And so the janitor's secret lived on, not a secret of plots or rebellion, but a secret of small acts of love that grew each day. The child waited eagerly for him, her laughter slowly returning to her lips, and the heiress watched from her hidden places. Her pride cracking, her certainty fading, she felt the storm building, for she knew the nobles would not remain silent forever. The whispers were turning sharp, the council's eyes had begun to focus, and soon the world would demand an answer. But for now, in that fragile peace, a human's kindness was healing what an empire had broken, a cruel confrontation. The palace was alive with light and sound on the day of the great gathering. Nobles from distant houses filled the grand hall, their robes shining with embroidered jewels, their voices rising in waves of arrogance. The air smelled of perfumes and heated oils, and the echo of laughter mixed with the clinking of crystal cups. The heiress sat on her raised throne, her daughter placed quietly at her side, bound to her chair, a silent shadow in the brilliance of the feast. Few gave her more than a passing glance, for to them she was a reminder of weakness, a flaw in the bloodline of a powerful house. It was during this gathering that a cruel voice rang out, shattering the surface calm. An alien noble, proud and sharp-tongued, turned his gaze upon the child. His words cut like knives as he laughed openly. How fitting that such a mighty heiress should have a daughter who cannot even walk. What kind of future can such a crippled child bring to her house? His laughter spilled into the hall, joined by a few other mocking chuckles, but most voices fell silent. For though many thought cruel things, few dared to speak them aloud in the presence of the heiress. Yet this one, swollen with his own pride, believed his words would go unchallenged. The child lowered her eyes, her small hands trembling in her lap. The shame that had been forced upon her all her life returned in a crushing wave, and her fragile chest tightened as though the cruel laughter itself was choking her breath. The hall grew tense, some nobles smirking, others uneasy, All eyes turned to the heiress, waiting to see her response, but before she could rise, before her tongue could shape a word, another voice cut through the silence. It was not the voice of a noble, nor of a guard, nor of a servant summoned to speak. It was the voice of the human janitor, rough with years of labor, quiet yet steady like the strike of a hidden bell. He stepped forward from where he had been cleaning the edges of the hall, his bucket still in hand, his face calm but his eyes burning with quiet fire. He moved until he stood between the noble's mocking gaze and the fragile girl in her chair. Gasps filled the chamber. The crowd could not believe what they were seeing. A human servant standing against a noble, placing himself before the heiress's child as though he were shield and guardian. His simple uniform was stained with dust and water, yet in that moment it looked stronger than any robe. His posture carried no fear. His shoulders were steady, his back unbent. He said nothing cruel in return, only looked down at the child and spoke softly. "Do not listen, little one. You are worth more than their laughter. You are worth more than they will ever understand." The words hung heavy in the air. For a heartbeat. The hall was frozen in disbelief, and then the storm began. Nobles rose from their seats, their voices rising in outrage. "How dare he speak?" shouted one. "A human servant has no tongue in this hall," cried another. The guards stepped forward, their hands gripping their weapons. Ready to drag him away, his defiance was unheard of, a spark of rebellion that threatened to shame the order of the entire gathering. The heiress sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had seen this man show kindness in the shadows. In quiet moments no one else noticed. But never had she seen him act with such courage, to stand in the heart of the grand hall, before nobles and guards and even before her own eyes, and to risk punishment not for himself, but for her daughter. It struck her like a bolt of lightning. She wanted to rise, to speak, but her pride warred with the storm of voices around her. The cruel noble laughed again, though his voice now wavered with anger. A janitor dares to shield the daughter of the heiress. How far have we fallen? Shall we allow vermin to speak against nobility? He raised his hand to call the guards closer. His face twisted with outrage, but the janitor did not step aside. He did not lower his eyes, he simply stood firm, his hand resting gently on the back of the child's chair. His presence told the noble and all others that though he had no power, no title, and no wealth, he had something none of them could touch: unshaken resolve. The child, her small body trembling, looked up at him with wide eyes. For the first time, she felt safe, as though someone had wrapped her in a shield stronger than any armor. Her lips trembled, but she whispered softly enough that only he and her mother could hear. "Thank you." That single word, so fragile, so quiet, struck the heiress harder than any insult from the noble. It was her daughter's gratitude not to her, not to her house, but to a human janitor who had stood when no one else had. The hall boiled with chaos. Nobles shouted for punishment, guards waited for command, and whispers ran like wildfire through the crowd. Some faces were shocked, others furious, but among them a few stared in silence, uncertain, shaken by the human's bravery. For deep inside, even the most prideful could not deny the strength in his defiance. The heiress finally rose, her robe flowing as silence fell once more. All eyes turned to her, waiting, the fate of the human balanced on the edge of her words. She looked at him, at her daughter, at the cruel noble, and at the sea of faces demanding judgment inside her chest. Pride and shame and awe battled with each breath. She did not yet speak her verdict, but in that heavy silence every soul in the hall felt the weight of the storm that was about to break, breaking chains of pride. The silence that followed in the great hall was heavier than stone. The nobles, who only moments before had shouted with fury, now waited in stiff stillness, for the heiress had risen from her throne, and all knew that her next words would shape the fate of the human janitor, the daughter, and perhaps even the dignity of the house itself. Her eyes, sharp as blades yet shadowed by something deeper, fixed on the man who stood in quiet defiance. Still resting his hand gently on her child's chair, he did not bow, he did not tremble, his simple uniform stained with the marks of his labor. And yet, in that moment, He carried a presence that unsettled even the proudest noble. She walked forward slowly, each step echoing across the marble floor like a drumbeat. The crowd parted with unease. The cruel noble who had mocked her daughter straightened with a smug expression, certain that the human would be punished. His lips curled into a smile, for he expected the heiress to unleash her pride and strip away the insolence that dared to stand against him. But when the heiress stopped in front of the janitor, the air grew tighter and every soul leaned closer, waiting to hear her voice when it came. Was low, measured, but filled with an edge of steel. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you risk yourself for a child who is not yours? Why do you stand against nobles who could end your life with a word?" The hall trembled with her question, for it was not only for him but for all to hear. She sought to force his motive into light, to show that it was ambition or greed or some hidden plot, for then she could judge him without guilt. Yet his answer did not bend to such expectation. The janitor met her gaze with eyes that carried no calculation, no fear, only truth. His voice was steady though quiet. "Because no one else will. Because she deserves more than silence. She deserves love, not pity, not mockery, and if I can give even a little of that, then it is worth whatever comes." The words cut through the hall like a blade. For the first time in memory, nobles who lived their lives in pride and suspicion had no argument ready. His words were too simple, too raw, too real. The heiress felt them strike against the walls of her heart, shaking foundations she had built with stone and pride. She wanted to deny them, to claim that nobility and wealth were what determined worth, yet in her own memory echoed the sound of her daughter's laughter. A sound born not of jewels or titles but of this man's small acts of compassion. The cruel noble broke the silence with a bark of laughter, his voice desperate to restore the order that had been shaken. "Empty words from a servant who seeks favor. Do not be fooled, my lady. His tongue is a weapon, his kindness a mask. If you do not punish him now, others will think humans may rise above their place, and that is poison to our blood." Murmurs rippled through the hall, some agreeing with him, others silent but conflicted. The Council of Nobles had long been built upon pride, and to allow a human's defiance to go unpunished threatened to break that foundation. The heiress turned her gaze to her child. The girl's small eyes were wet with tears, yet they shone with light. Her frail lips whispered again the words she had spoken earlier. "Thank you," directed not to her mother, not to the nobility, but to the man who stood beside her. The heiress felt her chest tighten, for in that moment she realized the truth she had been avoiding. This human had given her daughter something she herself had failed to give. He had given her hope, dignity, and warmth, without condition, without demand. And what had she given? Silence, distance, cold pride? Her heart burned with shame, yet around her the voices of nobles pressed in, demanding punishment, urging her to protect her honor. She felt the weight of generations upon her shoulders, every heiress before her standing tall in pride, every word carved into the palace walls warning against weakness. To defend this human was to strike against centuries of tradition, to risk her place, to invite scandal and rebellion from her own kind, yet to deny him was to crush the fragile smile that had returned to her daughter's face, to prove that nobility had no heart left, only empty pride. She closed her eyes, drawing a breath that felt heavier than the crown upon her brow. When she opened them again, there was no hesitation. Her voice rang clear. "This human has shown more honor than those who mock the weak. He has done what none of you have done. He has given my daughter joy, and for that I will not punish him. I will not silence him. His actions shame no one but those who cannot see the worth of kindness." Gasps spread like fire through the hall. Some nobles stared in outrage, their faces red with fury. Others looked down in silence, unwilling to meet her gaze. The cruel noble's smile vanished, replaced by anger. He stepped forward, his voice rising. "You cannot mean this. You risk the dignity of your blood. You would place a human above us." But the heiress silenced him with a single look, her eyes blazing with authority. The janitor bowed his head then, not from fear but from gratitude. His shoulders eased, and he whispered softly, "Thank you, my lady, but I did not do this for your thanks. I did it because it was right." The heiress's heart trembled again, for his words carried no chains, no attempt to bind her, only truth. In that moment she realized that the chains binding her were not his but her own, chains of pride, chains of fear of judgment, and now, for the first time, she felt them begin to break. The hall was divided, voices of fury clashing with voices of awe, yet one thing had changed forever. The heiress had chosen, and her choice was to value compassion over tradition. Though she knew the storm ahead would be fierce, though she knew the council would not forgive easily, she felt a strange strength growing inside her, a strength that came not from her blood, not from her title, but from her daughter's fragile smile and the defiance of a human who had reminded her what true nobility meant, the price of compassion. The days following the confrontation in the great hall were filled with unrest. What should have been forgotten as a single moment of insolence grew into a storm that spread through the palace and beyond. The nobles whispered in their chambers with tones of fury, their voices dripping with venom as they claimed the heiress had betrayed her station. They argued that she had lowered her honor by defending a human servant, that she had broken tradition by praising kindness over strength. Some demanded she correct her error with punishment, while others warned that the Council of Elders would soon intervene if she did not act to restore dignity. The palace had become a hive of suspicion, every corner alive with debate, and at the center of it all stood the human janitor who had asked for nothing, who still carried his bucket and brush as though the weight of the galaxy were not pressing against his back. The child, fragile but brighter than before, clung to his presence. Her laughter returned whenever he drew near, and her frail hands often reached for the toys he repaired. For her, the palace had become a little less cold, but for him the walls had grown sharper. Every servant who passed him now carried eyes of judgment, some filled with contempt, others with quiet respect. Yet even those who respected him dared not speak in his defense, for to do so was to invite the wrath of the council. The janitor knew this. He felt the change in the air, yet he did not bend. He worked each day as he always had, cleaning the stones of the palace, whispering small comforts to the girl and offering what little warmth he could. The Council of Elders, old and proud, gathered in secret to weigh the matter. They spoke in long voices about honor, blood, and the danger of allowing humans to step beyond their place. They did not speak of the child's joy, nor of the heiress's burden as a mother. They spoke only of pride and fear. In their view, the human was a seed of rebellion, a danger to their order. They drafted words of demand and sent them to the heiress, commanding that the janitor be dismissed at once, that he be stripped from her house before his example spread further. Some whispered execution, though the council cloaked their cruelty in the language of tradition. When the message reached her, the heiress sat in her chamber with the words heavy in her hands. She had known this day would come, yet still her heart ached with the weight of it. For she had seen her daughter's smile, she had heard her laughter, she had felt the warmth of a man who gave without condition, and to cast him away now was to cast away the very light that had returned to her child. Yet the council was not a voice she could easily deny. They were the power that shaped her world, the guardians of tradition, and if she opposed them openly, she risked not only her own standing but the safety of her daughter. She walked the corridors that night with her thoughts heavy. Her footsteps echoed softly as she approached the chamber where the human worked late. She found him there, bent over another toy, his hands patient, his face weary but calm. The child sat beside him, watching with wide eyes, smiling with a joy so rare it seemed to make the air itself glow. For a long moment the heiress did not speak. She simply watched, her heart torn between pride and love, between the chains of tradition and the call of compassion. At last she stepped forward, her voice low but trembling. "Do you not see what you have done? You have placed me against my own people. They demand your removal. They whisper of blood and honor. They will not stop until you are gone." The janitor lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers without fear. His voice was steady. "I did not seek to place you in danger, my lady. I only sought to give the child what she deserves. If my presence brings you harm, then cast me out. I will go quietly. I will not resist, but know this. She smiles not because of titles, not because of wealth, but because for once she was seen, she was loved. If you cast me away, do not let her lose that again." His words pierced her heart like arrows. For he asked nothing for himself, not safety, not reward, only that she protect the fragile joy he had returned to her daughter. In that moment she saw the truth more clearly than ever, that the council's demands were chains. Chains that sought to drag her back into silence. Chains that cared nothing for her child. She clenched her hands and turned away. Her breath shaking, she knew she could not obey. She could not strip her daughter of the only light she had been given. The next day the council gathered in the palace to demand their answer. The chamber was filled with nobles, their robes heavy with gold, their faces stern. The cruel noble from before stood among them, his smile sharp as he prepared to watch the heiress bow to their will. The child sat quietly in her chair, her toy clutched tightly in her lap, and beside her stood the janitor, his head lowered but his back unbent. The heiress rose, her face calm, her voice strong. "You call for his removal. You call for punishment, but I will not obey. He has given my daughter what none of you have. He has given her hope. If that shames you, then perhaps it is not him who lowers the dignity of this house, but you." The chamber erupted in fury, voices clashing like thunder. Some shouted for her deposition. Others demanded the human's death. The air burned with outrage. Yet through the storm the heiress stood unbroken, her daughter watching her with eyes full of light. The janitor bowed slightly, his heart heavy yet steady, for he knew that compassion always demanded a price. He did not know if he would live through the days to come, but he knew his axe had planted a seed that no council could destroy, a seed that had already begun to grow in the heart of the heiress's transformation. The chamber was thick with rage, the air alive with the venom of nobles who had never been defied in their lives. Their voices clashed against one another, sharp and loud, demanding punishment, demanding blood, demanding that the heiress restore order by casting out the human janitor who had dared to stand where none of them would. The council's elders, seated in their high chairs of stone, looked down with faces carved from pride. Their words were like hammers striking iron. "You shame your bloodline. You shame this council. You place a servant above tradition, above honor, above the very pillars of our kind. You will correct this, or you will face the weight of our judgment." The heiress stood still in the storm. Her robe shimmered with the light of the hall, but her heart was no longer wrapped in jewels or pride. She had spent sleepless nights torn between fear and truth, between the chains of tradition and the fragile laughter of her daughter. Now, in this chamber where all eyes sought her defeat, she felt clarity, for she had witnessed something no wealth could buy, no law could command. She had seen a human, a man with nothing but a bucket and brush, give her daughter more dignity, more kindness, more love than her own house had given. She raised her head, her eyes blazing with a strength that none expected. Her voice rang across the hall like a blade striking against stone. "You speak of shame, but I tell you it is you who should feel shame. You sit in robes of power, yet you could not spare a glance for a child who suffers. You call yourselves noble, yet it was a human janitor who showed what nobility truly means. If you cannot see that, then it is not honor you protect but the emptiness of your pride." The words struck the chamber into silence. Nobles shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another, for no one had ever heard an heiress speak so openly against the council. The cruel noble, his face burning red with fury, shouted, "You betray us. You spit on our blood. You place vermin above your kind." He raised his arm as though to command the guards, but none moved, for all eyes were locked on the heiress. Then, to the shock of every soul present, she did something unthinkable. She stepped down from her throne, moving to stand beside her daughter's chair, and there, before the eyes of the council and the gathered nobles, she knelt, her hand rested on her daughter's thin shoulder, her other hand lifted the repaired toy that the janitor had fixed, and she held it high for all to see. "This," she said, her voice steady, "this broken toy, mended by human hands, carries more worth than your empty laughter. It carries joy. It carries hope. It carries what you have forgotten. The child's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as she reached for her mother. For the first time in her memory, her mother was not a distant figure of power but someone kneeling beside her, someone who chose to stand with her in weakness rather than stand above her in pride. The janitor lowered his head, his heart heavy with humility, for he had never sought such recognition. Yet in that moment he knew his small axe had shaken the walls of an empire. The chamber erupted again, but the storm was different now. Some nobles shouted still for punishment, their voices shrill with fear of change, but others fell into silence, their eyes clouded with doubt. They could not erase what they had witnessed. The image of an heiress kneeling before her child and defending a human's honor burned into their minds. The council's elders growled with fury, but even their power could not wash away the truth that had been spoken aloud. The heiress rose slowly, lifting her daughter into her arms despite her frail body. She looked at the council and declared, "I will not cast him out. I will not bow to your fear. I will not let tradition chain my child to silence. If you wish to strip me of my place, then do it. But know this, you cannot strip away the truth. The truth is that humanity has shown a strength we have forgotten, and I will not be blind any longer." Her words spread beyond the chamber, carried by servants and guards, by those who whispered in markets and those who spoke in distant halls. The tale of the heiress who defied the council, who knelt beside her daughter, and who defended a human janitor's honor, became a fire that spread too far to be contained. Some mocked it, some hated it, but others felt something stir inside them, a question they could not silence. Had they mistaken pride for strength all along? In the days that followed, the council tried to regain control, but their fury only fed the whispers. The heiress faced their wrath, but she no longer trembled, for she had found a new strength, not in their approval, but in her daughter's smile, in the warmth of a man who had reminded her what compassion meant. She walked the halls no longer chained by pride, but guided by something stronger. And, at her side, though still carrying his bucket and brush, the human janitor remained, humble yet unshaken, a living reminder of the price of compassion and the power of kindness. The child, once a silent shadow, now laughed more often, her voice filling the cold halls with warmth. And though the path ahead was filled with storms, though the nobles would never forget their anger, the heiress knew she had chosen rightly. For in her heart the transformation was complete. She was no longer only a daughter of tradition, no longer only a guardian of pride. She was a mother who had chosen her child, a leader who had chosen truth, and a woman who had chosen to break the chains of arrogance. The janitor had asked for nothing, yet his actions had changed everything. And as the stars shone above the palace that night, brighter than ever before, the heiress whispered to herself the truth she had tried for so long to deny. Compassion is not weakness, it is the greatest strength. And with that truth, an empire built on pride began to tremble.